Good evening, everybody. Have a seat. Have a seat. Get comfortable. We're glad you're here. Some faces I know, some faces are new to me, but you're all welcomed and they're all good faces, so can't go wrong. My name is Terrell Mitchell-Smith. I am the newly minted chairman of the board for Connecticut Democracy Center, and are more familiarly known as CTDC is what we call it for short. And we've been around for a while, but not necessarily as the Connecticut Democracy Center. We started off as the Connecticut Public Affairs Network, or CPAN, and in 1999 we launched CTN, which is, if you don't know what that is the station that records and produces all the programming for the Connecticut State Legislature, whatever goes on in the Capitol, subcommittee meetings and all that wonderful stuff. And then we branched into another partnership with the state, and we took over the old State House, and we've done wonderful things on both ends. We have award-winning programs at the old State House. In particular, Kid Governor, and if you look in the corner over here, you'll see the newly elected Kid Governor. He is from Chase School here in Waterbury, and it's apropos that we're here tonight after knowing that he's been elected. So we would have had him come tonight, but he's a little young. He's probably in bed getting ready for school, so. And I'm old, and I would probably be in bed just because I'm old. So we're glad you're here, though, and we wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. And when we became the Connecticut Democracy Center last year, if I'm not mistaken, I think we incorporated as that and changed our name to that. We did it because we wanted to branch out. We have a great foundation, an incredible foundation. Kid Governor, we have History Day, and just a little point for Kid Governor, 10,000 students registered to vote for the Kid Governor program this year. That is absolutely, Brian, Sally, congratulations to you guys. They run an excellent program, and we have so many. We have so many different programs that we run, and we touch everybody from K through 12. So we said we need to branch out and reach others. So we said, okay, let's do college, adults, and see what we can do, because we feel civics is really important. Part of civics, we treat civics as a verb. It's something that you do. It's a right that you have that we hope people understand. Not only is it a right, but how much power you have when you exercise civics. And it's community-based. It's things that we think that really come from, the best ideas come from communities that come from groups that work together. My mother always had a phrase, there are a lot of us. I was the last of 7 kids. And she always talked about collective genius. And it always worked because you sat down, you listened, you heard, and everybody didn't agree, but you did have to come to an agreement by the time you got through listening to everybody else. And it's the kind of method that you just say, it's mutual respect and it's civil. And that's part of civics. And that's the kind of thing we want to promote. And we don't want to just keep it in one place. That's why we're the Connecticut Democracy Center. So this program is called Civics on the Road. This is our second event. The first, we're starting at the bottom, we're starting with the W's. First we were in Westport, now we're in Waterbury, and we're going to move our way up. And our goal is to go around the state and let you know who we are and what we do and what our goals are and what our mission is. And I want to thank so many of our board members for being here. And we run the gamut. We're a very diverse group. And I always like to tell this story. Deidre, who is sitting right here, we were having a meeting one time, and she said, we're talking about what we want to do to recruit new board members and things like that. And she said, well, can we get young people? And we were like, what? What's wrong with us? And then we looked around the room, we're like, yeah, we are pretty old, average-wise. So we did. We went out and recruited young people. So now we have people like James Turner, who is on our board. And we have a lot of good people. We have a lot of good people working. And, you know, just the breadth of talent that we have. We have Alice, who's been handling, you know, head of finance. We've got investments going. Who else do we have? Anita and I, we do communications, you know. So everybody does a little bit of everything. And then we have Jonathan, who's going to be our featured speaker this evening, who is kind of like a Renaissance man. He writes books. Do you sing and do you do artwork too, Jonathan? He does it all. He does it all. And so he's going to kind of, and he's a professor. So he teaches at Southern, and where else have you taught, Jonathan? And Gateway. So he's done a lot. And we think that he can put what we want to do and where we want to go into perspective. So not to drag out the evening, we'll get to the highlight, and I'm going to introduce Jonathan. Jonathan Wharton, come on up. And
thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate it. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. You know, for me, it's rare that, you know, people, even my own students, are even interested in state and local government. It's unfortunate because so many of my students, and I think we know this in general, are aware of how government operates, not even so much at the federal level, but even at the state and local level. And this is critical, obviously, in light of Connecticut's roots, since really this is obviously the place that devised up the fundamental orders. And God knows I'm always repeating this in my class, and they will never forget that it wasn't about allegiance to the king or to God, but to the sovereignty and to the people, and that's where power derives. And so for even many of us who grew up here, it's still not being taught or reinforced here, and it's unfortunate. So for me, I'm glad to be helping to play a role, not only in the classroom, but even here on the board. And so I'm glad to be a part of this even this evening. I'll assume, by the way, the next W will probably be my hometown, West Hartford. Why not? Well, I was about to say, we have a former mayor who's on the board. I'm sure Jonathan would appreciate that. Right? Why not? So what I'll do here is I'll give you a few slides. I'm not a PowerPoint king. God knows I don't like PowerPoints, but I wanted to at least give some examples of some things. Trust me, I'm not going to overkill you with it because that's obviously a vocational hazard being in academia. But I do want to make sure that I get to questions because that's going to be critical. And there are going to be mics floating around as well for your questions because I'm more of a engage and get everybody in a discussion and debate kind of person more than anything else. So I don't want to bore you like I do my freshmen. And it's already, you know, and today's actually the last day of class, so they were done with me. So I'll give you at least some ideas to kind of chew on and discuss about for this evening. In light of everything that's going on, not just so much in Connecticut, but obviously what's going on even domestically, and certainly for what's going to be taking place in Washington. By the way, I kind of like my PowerPoint. I like how I kind of played on a point on purpose with the Civics on the road, like we're behind the wheel here. Right? So let me give you a little bit about my background so you can understand a little bit my perspective of where I'm coming from. Because many people might just assume that, you know, oh, well, yeah, he teaches state and local government, so he's got to know this maybe more from the textbook style. I'm actually very proud of being one of the few who actually is a practitioner of this. You know, I've worked at all levels of government, even before I went into the classroom. You know, I initially started out working as a congressional aide for both sides of the aisle. I know, don't throw, you know, eggs and tomatoes at me, because God knows my students are like, oh my God, you're a dinosaur. Who would ever work for both sides? And my students are like, you know, how's that even possible? It's not these days. It's just not, even on Capitol Hill. I mean, I've been shocked whenever I go down to Washington, I catch up with friends, and they're like, yeah, we don't ride the elevators with the Democrats, or we're not going to ride the subway with the Republicans. And I'm like, oh my God, is this high school? It's gotten like that now. It has gotten like that. That is really frustrating to me. It's unfortunate. But I'm fortunate that I've worked for both sides of the aisle for 6 years. And I really want to stress this. I had the opportunity to be a doctoral fellow at the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. And so they're kind of an arm shoot. Oh, that's right. You probably remember. I didn't even think about that. It's a former rep. God, of course. Of course you remember. You knew. Oh, there you go. I love it. I love it. So thankfully I had that experience working directly with lawmakers. And you know those conventions that they have where they discuss out resolutions and proposals. So I had that hands-on experience directly working with the lawmakers coming from a variety of different backgrounds and certainly states. And so for me, I've always been intrigued by intergovernmental relations for that reason. And so I did that for a couple of years with the fellowship, and then they brought me on as a consultant to help out with their conferences for a few years. That was a great little gig to have as a graduate student, because I did go to Howard initially for history, but I returned back for political science for my PhD, and I did go to Rutgers in between for history. So I've always been kind of interested in seeing the dimensions there in Washington. And so speaking of Rutgers, at least in New Jersey, after I graduated, and even when I was there a bit, I also served as a fellow through the Eagleton Institute of Politics, where I had the opportunity to work for an agency called OLS, the Office of Legislative Services. Now, we in Connecticut have it. It's the twisted sister, the Office of Legislative Research. It's the same thing. It's a nonpartisan wing, nonpartisan agency that's doing the bill drafting, the resolution drafting. And so for me, I had that exposure for a couple of years working in Trenton. So for me, I've always been fascinated, just as a practitioner, not even so much as an academic or as an author, just more as a practitioner, getting in the weeds on what is taking place and how this process works and how it functions and operates. So yes, I teach my state and local government. They have fixed me lately doing more US government classes, which is really annoying me because God knows I don't like talking about Washington in the current state of things. But I've been sucked into that with teaching freshman sections since nobody wants to teach freshmen. So fine, I'll battle it out with them as we talk about, even government politics in DC. But for me, this has been a big aspect of who I am and my background. Paul, am I getting it? Oh, there we go, okay. So this is interesting timing to have this talk because I don't know if you all saw this article that came out this week from the Washington Post about Waterbury. It was an awesome piece that was discussing why more voters have been leaning towards Trump in Waterbury, and even in Mattatuck Valley in general. But this is no secret. The authors kind of cracked me out because they were kind of stunned that here we are, big blue state, supposedly, arguably, and God knows I always remind people, don't forget the majority of your local mayors and first selectmen are Republicans. All right, as much as everybody says we're blue, 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 there are different levels of what blue we are here and which town we're in. Mattatuck Valley, in some ways, is an anomaly, if you're familiar with this area, this region, because, yes, it's still the land of Reagan Democrats. And so this article kind of speaks towards this, and I would highly recommend you find that article. It's a good little read in light of the fact that we're here in Waterbury. And what the mayor, both the former and the current mayor, offer is that when it comes to national politics, many voters in Waterbury, like in Mattatuck Valley, are still overwhelmingly concerned about economic issues, especially because of the fact of unemployment being a concern here and just vocations. Obviously, this is Brass City. It was once a place in space where, obviously, a lot of brass was made, and yet the economy has obviously collapsed and has not come back in decades. So this article kind of touches on that and how somebody like Trump comes along and emphasizes opportunity. And so this is interesting in light of what's gone on in the Valley for the last couple generations. Then I'm going to be speaking a little bit more towards this. My class and I were debating about this morning, as a matter of fact. California, being California, Daniela, forgive me, has for years, even when Trump was president, trying to find a way to stratify what to do about Washington and even the Trump presidency. And so even right now, they're discussing and debating about having a way to do Trump-proof approaches to deal with the incoming administration. In years past, when Trump was president, they filed nearly 122 lawsuits against the federal government, and particularly the Trump administration, okay? And so they spent well over $40 million on that. In an effort to be ready for this, they're trying to pass legislation to have a fund for $25 million for the incoming administration. So this is an interesting approach in terms of response to what we could see at the state level. And certainly you know this, being involved with lawmakers. Well, as a lawmaker, you know this. It's not unusual that some states will take on or consider what approaches there are and what could be done in response to what's going on in Washington. So that's kind of the example I will certainly discuss tonight. So what is this? Well, this is textbook case example of what they call intergovernmental relations. Few Americans really understand and respect this, and God knows I'm emphasizing this with all the classes I teach, especially at the state and local level, that yes, there is the federal government. Yes, it's the national central government. But we also have some unique aspects beyond federalism that exist. States clearly have the possibility of state rights, which you'll hear so often, especially with court cases. Local level government, of course, there's home rule. God knows you hear about this all the time in Connecticut. God forbid, don't touch education or housing issues because it's home rule. Technically, it's Dillon's rule as well because of the prior judge emphasizing that for a local government to have power and control, it's got to come from the state government. But no matter which way you call it, and remember, we don't have county government in Connecticut. So, because obviously we love our little local home rule so much, since we did away with it in the late 1950s. But I did put county down there because I don't want to exclude it, because there's some states where the counties are very strong. I'm looking at LA again for that, because obviously in California it's all about county government, all right? So I want you to consider this as it relates to intergovernmental relations, because that's essentially what this is what will be, kind of what I'm going to be offering, what's going to happen in the future here with some of these topics, just as a refresher. Oh, I got it. Okay, so not ready for the cakes yet. Oh, Paul, I'll get the hang of this. So what are we going to consider here when it comes to Washington? Well, certainly you've been reading and hearing a lot in the press what's taking place here. With the incoming White House, the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and certainly with the administration, and certainly the picks that he's considering, along with the Senate, because remember they have to go through the confirmation process, it's going to be a shared entity in the sense of control and power. Now, technically, the textbook case is what they call, unified government. God knows I love my fellow political scientists using these terms and making it sound like it's absolute, and it's exactly this. But keep in mind that it's very narrow among the Republicans, okay? Remember, we're dealing with only 5 seats difference in the House. And 3 of those 5 are appointees are going to be part of the Trump administration potentially. So special elections now to replace and to deal with that. So the Republicans are quite out of the woods there in Congress. And for the Senate, remember, it's only 3 differences. So it's gotten very close. Certainly it's unified government in the sense of, yes, Republican majority, but keep in mind that there's still going to be internal divisions, as is naturally the case with Congress. As a former congressional aide, I can tell you, you all might assume, oh, well, they're all Democrats, they get along. Oh, they're all Republicans, they get, no. There's a lot of politics, there's a lot of personalities, there's a lot of egos, there's a lot of agenda setting, and there will be classic disagreement. So you can't just assume that because there's a D or an R behind the name, one way or the other, they're going to be, getting along. If anything, there'll be a lot of division, and we've known this already within the caucuses of each chamber. So it's one thing within the caucus, it's quite another within the chamber. And even amongst the chambers, there's a lot of natural disagreement. So do keep that in mind, even if it is a unified government. Then the final thing here is the Supreme Court. This is going to be critical, because there's going to be a lot of court cases coming down the pike. There already have been, as I said, even the example in California. So where and how the Supreme Court justices will land will be important to consider, but I would emphasize pay special attention to your appellate courts, because even before it goes to the Supreme Court, it's got to go through that first. That's critical for precedent's sake. So keep that perspective and following that at that level. Now, I kind of make light of this in class, and God knows my freshmen hate my little Betty Crocker jokes. But I will always say, what kind of cake are we? We like cakes. And God knows this past semester I'm disturbed with my freshmen because they admitted they like pies. Oh, I was furious. I am such a cake head. I'm like, how do you not like cakes? You like warm fruit? Come on. I was disgusted. Then some kid raised their hand and said, yeah, but I like cookies. I'm like, okay, we can be friends. So what a lot of political scientists will say is that, when you want to think about government and power, equate it to cakes. One argument when it comes to federalism is that it's dual federalism operated. That the national government, the federal government is at the top, the state government is down there, and you can add also local county government below that, okay? Most people will stress, especially since the 1980s, because of the Reagan Revolution, that no, if anything, it's supposed to be shared power or cooperative federalism, where, at least at the state and national level, there are moments where it's like a marble cake, especially when it comes to programs like Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of thing, where they might be contributing or giving more money both ways in terms of budgeting and also in terms of power. So that's another way to kind of recognize at least intergovernmental relations, is to think about the layer cake or the marble cake. I tend to see it more layer cake, but that's probably because I'm probably more of an institutionalist more than I want to admit. But that's another thing to consider at least. Now, in response to what could be taking place with Congress and even how the courts might resolve what to do with the Trump administration, keep this in mind. So many of my colleagues, not just in political science, but my friends and neighbors, are all having meltdowns about what's going on in Washington. I get it. But also respect the fact, going back about intergovernmental relations, what the states and local government can do, there are some approaches to kind of deal with Washington, whether it was Trump or not. At the state and local level, they're constantly battling it out already with the federal government. And so what can governors do? We already know this. They can issue letters, demands, agreements, lawsuits. I mean, do I have to bring up what happened with COVID? I mean, some governors obviously responded one way, another governor operated another, and then some said, well, we're going to issue letters and say, hey, this is how we should respond to a public health crisis. I mean, I don't know if you followed what happened in Rhode Island during COVID, but the governor there said, if you're not from Rhode Island, you're not welcomed here. And you guys might remember this. They had state troopers there at 95. And I was like, ooh, this is pretty cool. I wonder what would happen with my Connecticut tags going in now. Right? So, don't forget that the governors and even at the state level, there's some things which they'll do and they'll test. I'm not saying it works, but there are some powers in which they will try and test the waters with. So I brought the example of California and its 120-something lawsuits back in 2016 to 2020 when that took place, when Trump was president. And as I said, they're trying to deal with this $25 million budget fund. Executive officials also can issue regulations and challenges and all kinds of policies too. So I don't want to ignore that. That's critical for this. The big thing we'll see, though, and you all already know this, is going to be the attorneys general, at least, coming from the states. They could easily enter in agreements and memos and letters and also have their demands and press lawsuits. And that's the big thing. We're expecting probably an uptick if anything, of lawsuits, especially coming from the states. And lawmakers, of course, this is my favorite thing in the world. God knows I was talking about this in class on Tuesday. They love hearings. They live for workshops and discussions. Anything to highlight and bring attention to the issue. And you know this will be happening. It's already been happening, but we're going to be seeing more of this among state lawmakers. So don't ignore that. Now, part of it will be a lot of just show and tell, flash and all this, but it'll be interesting to follow because that's the way that they tend to go about this, is to have hearings and investigations and to consider what can we do about the federal government. So that's kind of atypical as to their strategies. One thing I'm always mindful of and I emphasize is this. We are unique in Connecticut. We're not only just part of the tri-state area, we're part of New England. Now, of course, we can battle this out tonight, because God knows my students will fight about it, saying, no, I'm a New Englander, I don't believe in New York. And God knows, I love the people from Fairfield County. What is New England? So we have to keep in mind we're right in the middle. And uniquely so, because remember, historically, we're used to being on all sides of the issue, even back at the convention. I mean, that's why we had the Great Compromise, right? Or the Connecticut Compromise. So we're unique in the sense that yes, we oftentimes have to work with the governors in the tri-state area, especially with New York. Obviously, what's going on is that they're going to have a mayoral race next year, so you know there's going to be a lot of attention on that in response to what's going on with immigration and what's going to be taking place with everything in Washington. So expect that. And then the one thing I want to put on people's radars is don't forget New Jersey, because they're having a governor's race as well. And God knows there's a lot of Democrats already announcing they're planning to run. Why does that matter in Connecticut? Because the candidates are going to be offering their suggestions and ideas of what to do about Washington, what to do about state control, what to do about lawsuits. So what I'm trying to say is expect a lot of this down the pike in terms of, they're going to be offering a lot of, talk and about these issues. And what about Connecticut? Could Lamont want to run for a third term? This is almost kind of the kiss of death for governors, right? Because typically it's 2, rarely 3, unless they die in office or unless obviously they go to jail. But we need to keep this in mind that when it comes to it, could this be a possibility for Ned Lamont, for him to run or not? And if it were, what kind of issues would be coming up as it related to Washington? In other words, are they going to politicize what's going on in Washington or not? Expect it. Expect it. And as far as the Senate and the House seats, we already know obviously there's a supermajority in the General Assembly. We're already aware of that. But expect obviously lawmakers to make known of this. And I don't want to ignore our nearby neighbors, Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It's easy to. God knows I want to avoid them, but you can't. Massachusetts is interesting because they have open primaries, unlike us, where we have closed primaries. And so expect a little bit of the politics coming out to kind of bring up interest of what's going on in Washington for people to run for office there. And Rhode Island is just Rhode Island, obviously. Yes, majority blue and Democrat, but obviously there's a lot of skirmishes and problems going on there at the state level among Democrats. They're certainly battling it out, and it's interesting to see whether they'll bring up some of these issues that's going on in Washington to the fray there in Rhode Island. So why do states matter? I use a book called States Matter. It's a great book for my class. I'm oftentimes emphasizing this. Matt and I were talking about this in a meeting about this book, and he knows the book. I absolutely love that book because it stresses that it's not all about Washington. All right, if anything, a lot of the legislation actually originates at the state capitol. Should I hide behind the podium? Because God knows my students will just bicker at me, you know, because they're like, no, no. I'm like, yes, yes. A lot of these laws that go on in Washington comes from our state capitals. Shocker. It does, especially from the big states. New York, Texas, California. They're kind of the original, you know, lawmakers that are putting out these proposals. And so expect that from your big states. And what I'll put along with that is that there's going to be a lot of research done and completed by a number of different officials, and certainly by a number of lawmakers and their aides. And so that's why I'm putting that down there. Party officials will do the same research, think tanks that are nearby. God knows you all know the lobbyists and media are oftentimes hounding on these things. And I don't want to ignore, obviously, fellow academics like myself and observers who will consider what are the regional laws and proposals, and how can we deal with Washington or not deal with Washington. So that's usually kind of the emphasis that will take place. And at the local level, which I'm constantly emphasizing, because in my heart of hearts, I'm more of a local government guy, because I always feel like, you know what? I can always knock on my, you know, state lawmaker's door, because God knows she lives across the street. I've never knocked on my door, but you know, it's that kind of thing. And when I was in New Jersey, my mayor lived a block away. My councilwoman lived right across the street from her. So the great thing at the local level in terms of engagement and involvement, especially when it comes to Washington issues, is it's right in your own backyard. And if you look at the surveys, it's fascinating, right? You guys already know this. Was it 80 to 85% of Americans do not like Congress, right? We know that. We hate Congress. We loathe Congress. Your Supreme Court lately has been getting higher numbers. I think they're getting close to 70%, which is weird because it used to be 40%, all right? And, but when it comes to state government, most people like the governor, and you all obviously know that Ned Lamont's one of the top 3 popular governors here in the country. He might even be number 2. I bet you he moved up. But when it comes to local officials, we like our local officials. It's amazing the numbers of people who like local officials because we know them. Even if we don't like them, we at least connect and can bond with them. So they usually come in at around 70 to 80% of approval ratings. But then look what goes on when it comes to mayoral and council races. You barely get 15 to 25% of turnout taking place at our local races. Well, what's going on next year? We have municipal races taking place. So you know some of these issues are going to come up, at least what's going on in Washington, even what's going on with the state budget at the local level, because it's going to have an impact at the local level. But we need to do something about turning that around, because it was never that low. In fact, it used to be far higher. It used to be 40, 50% in some of our bigger cities like New Haven and Hartford, but it's been halving since the early 2000s. So what could be done about that? Well, we could see this maybe in November, where we could see competitive local races to get more candidates to show up, to get more people to talk about the issues that's going on in their towns and cities in the state and local level. And so what's critical is making sure that you have viable party committees that exist and certainly candidates. And one thing I think is going to be very critical next year will be planning and zoning economic development issues. Of course, that's kind of the heart of my research. And it's no secret in Connecticut, this is a battle royale taking place when it comes to vocational housing, and certainly when it comes to housing equity issues and you know, issues surrounding affordable housing, especially near train stations. And of course, my big thing is regional considerations, how a lot of municipalities are going to work or not work together, and whether there could be a partnership possibility when it comes to revenue sharing or program sharing. Because I know there's been some talk about this between Hartford and East Hartford as an example. So in Connecticut, what do we have to think about in the future? Well, we can't rely so much on COVID funding the way we used to, because obviously there's nothing left. And if anything, we're going to get less federal funding from Washington. We should expect that, not just for us, but the states in general. And of course, we know that the lingering issue has been the pension obligations, because it's almost $8 billion. And certainly, don't forget, a lot of public contract employees are going to be up for negotiations next year. We know that we have over $4 billion in our budget reserve fund, what you all call a rainy day fund. I hate that term, but it's technically called a budget reserve. And we also know what's in place right now is a spending cap or fiscal guardrails for a state budget, and there's been a little leverage for negotiation on that. So expect a lot of debate and discussion for this in Connecticut. This is not going to go away. Why? We know the expenditures related to health care has gone through the roof. It's been a big concern, and still when it comes to social services costs for education, it's still an ongoing demand. I will not ignore, nor should you, about what it relates to economic growth in our cities and our towns for the state, but also transportation concerns, public transit, highways, that kind of thing. With getting less funding coming from the federal government, how are we going to deal with these demands for the incoming budget for 2025, which you know will be a big discussion. And beyond that, what do we do nationally, even at the state level too? Because major political parties right now experience what we call political realignment, where there are ideological changes and shifts taking place nationally, and even a bit in Connecticut. And my big question is, where does this leave state and local officials and candidates because of what's going on nationally, especially when you think about the local races taking place next year? And my big thing is the federal pressures. Will it be political reform? How will states and localities fall in line or resist any of these changes coming from Washington? I mean, yes, the lawsuits are a tactic, but they will also find a way to kind of amend and address the bigger issue. And finally, this is the crux of it all. What about future generations? Your Gen Z, your alphas, they're coming of age within the next couple of years here, and even voters here. And so how are they going to come to understand politics and engagement and voting and party affiliation? You all know it's no secret, Generation Z has the highest number of unaffiliated voters ever. They do not like political parties. Neither do I, quite frankly. But in Connecticut, we have closed primaries, you need to join a side. Now, whether that's the crazy or the evil side, I suppose, you know, it's for one for you to engage. But we're finding younger people not to be engaged with the local party. What can you do about that? What about media literacy? How do you get younger people to follow what's taking place in the news? This is a big issue. Over and over again, we see in surveys, not just in Connecticut, but even nationally, that few young people are paying attention to the news. And if they do, it's mostly through social media. It's not directly through a credible news source. And that's critical to follow these issues. And then finally, my big thing I love is political socialization. What can we do to make sure that young people are involved and engaged in knowing what the news is, what the issues are, how government operates? That comes from home. Yes, it's great to get this in school. We'll not deny that. But it's critical to get this emphasized at home, among their friends, among their mentors, among their religious leaders, you name it. It's an entire unit for them to understand and to at least connect with government and politics. So that's going to be a big issue which we'll be paying attention to. So those are kind of my big questions that I'm kind of throwing out there. And would love to hear from you all on your questions and what's going to happen for next year. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you. Oh, we got a question. Oh, Madam Chair. I love it.
Thank you. My question is, there was a lot of money thrown around in this last election. In fact, all of the elections. And I want to just understand how much influence, you know, wealthy people, people who are like Elon Musk and others, you know, not just one or two, but have over elections. I mean, because it's one vote for each person.
Right.
So what is the importance of millions and billions of dollars being thrown around?
It's critical, and it's my biggest pet peeve. You're getting right there, campaign finance reform. And of course, in light of the Citizens United case versus FEC, it's now allowable because donations are considered free speech. And so there's really no limitation when it comes to, you know, soft money, money that goes unregulated, and obviously some of the special PACs that are created to go along with that. Super PACs, at least, they can establish these education initiatives or ads and whatever, and yes, big donors. A lot of this goes unregulated. Until Washington, and specifically Congress, deals with the loopholes of the court case, nothing's going to be done. My class and I were debating about this actually 2 weeks ago. What was it that we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s that allowed for the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act to pass? What was it then that we're lacking now? It was a resolve among American voters who were determined, and they made their voices heard directly to Washington, saying we need to get this thing passed. And both parties recognized that, and there became a sea change. Thankfully, I worked on Capitol Hill when that happened. I'm grateful that I did, because I was struck by it. We all were as congressional aides that, oh my God, both sides of the aisle agree on something, And the constituents are now responding, and they're testifying, and they're protesting, and they're demonstrating. And so when you get something like that going, watch out. Vincent Hutchings calls it the sleeping giant principle. Get one big issue to get some kind of resolve and get lawmakers and constituents involved. It wakes up an entire idea. So until we see that issue become a bigot, it's not going to happen. I don't see the lawmakers doing it from the other side, unless they're together and really the constituents emphasize it. My biggest pet peeve of Washington, though. Oh, Anita, please.
What would it take for Connecticut to become an open primary state? Ooh. Is it an easy question?
No, that's a good question.
Okay, good, okay.
Actually, it's interesting because my Tuesday night class, I teach Connecticut politics, my graduate class, and we were discussing this for like the last half hour because, to my point about younger voters not being affiliated with a political party, they were obsessed about this. They read John Permont's book, I'm sure you all know it, El Grasso, and they were reading the last chapters about this, about how the political parties have become so divided, and what do we do about these open primaries thing, and it came out with that. What's required, and a lot of my students tend to forget this, is both political parties have to be in agreement to say, we're going to allow Connecticut to be an open primary. All right, and so the parties have to be in agreement to do this in the first place, to provide for that reform. Same thing with whether to end the convention system or not, because we're only 1 out of 9 states to do a convention. You all know that. It's kind of a bygone era to do the endorsement and have a convention at the casinos or your convention center in Hartford. I mean, we are throwbacks. We love our land of steady habits. It's great and nice, but these kind of reforms rarely can be done. I'll give credit, though. The Democrats have been talking about it in the last year or two. I'm kind of like, oh, this is interesting to consider open primaries. But then the Republicans have to be on the same page, too. And, I was a party official for the state party for a couple of years, and I emphasized this at the dinners. Some people were interested. Most people, it fell silent. And they reminded me, yeah, but the Democrats have to be on board with it. So they're going to be pointing fingers. Who's going to be the one to,
If everybody had in their focus that we have to get young people to vote, and if our young people are telling us that this is how this needs to be presented to us, if we were all on the same page about voting, making sure that young people understand and vote, could that be the strategy?
It could be a start. But remember, young voters, I hate saying this, they're not a reliable base to rely on because they don't show up. And beyond the fact that they might not have the party affiliation, they generally don't show up in a general election unless it's even a national election. Even when they do, that's like 40% of the time. And in local races, you're lucky to get like 10, 15%. So the other thing we need to consider, and I should emphasize this, is one of the reasons why Connecticut still has a closed primary system is they want party loyalty. They want to assure, especially your party activists and your officials, that you remain tethered to that political party, and they want to rely on that base every time. So the notion to open up the walls now, open up the door to having more people, is a concern for a lot of local officials, and so they don't want that. And so that has been a big issue that I hear constantly with party officials, is that to do that would be problematic. Good example, look at Massachusetts. They have open primaries, but they barely have a little over 30% of Democrats in the register of the party, and the Republicans are only 8, 9%. Whereas we're more than double, almost double that in Connecticut. So that's the thing, is that you'll lose people because they'll be unaffiliated. And so they will participate in open primaries, but they won't have that party affiliation. It won't grow up, but they'll participate. And don't forget, in our cities, it's overwhelmingly, in many cities, not all, but many, one-party domination. So, the primary is the election for local races. That's something I'm always emphasizing, Anita, always. And that's why I say participate in these primaries as best as you can, especially when you know it's one party. You need a challenge. You need candidates. We call it democracy. I don't know what you all call it. When it's one party and one candidate and that's it, I don't know what you all want to call that. It's not an election to me. Who else? You had a question, right? You got it. Oh, there was one. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you got it. Yep.
Sorry.
Sorry.
So you touched on social media and how younger generations, that's really the only way they're getting their news, which is so polarizing. And once you click on one thing, your algorithm just keeps showing you more and more and more.
Yep.
And darker and more twisted news. How do you see that ever changing or shaping younger minds to not be so polarized in their future views?
It is a difficult challenge, especially for me, even personally in the classroom, because I'm trying to get them to turn that around and for them to be the ones to be the first ones to read the actual articles or pay attention to the actual media as opposed to getting filtered from uncle or auntie who posted something on Facebook or the friends who did something on TikTok. And I will tell you right now, I'm probably way too much of a political romantic, but I do see at least some resolve by a number of my students who recognize now at the end of the semester, because we spoke about that this week. They're like, you know one thing? Now I recognize the difference. Because I make sure we do current events quizzes every week, and they're following the headlines. And so now they admit and they acknowledge, wow, this is actually helpful, that I'm reading it myself now. I'll also give credit to Southern. We have something that's unique. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the library subscribes for. There's no paywall access. If you have that email address, it's free access. Got to give credit to the university for something like that. That's awesome for what the librarians did, because that's a good start for media literacy, for them to even get in that habit of doing it. But I'll be frank with you, and this sounds really negative of me, it's almost a lost cause by the time they come to my class. If they didn't get this in high school or even in middle school, and I'm trying to relearn or trying to get them engaged, it's tough. It's tough. They don't want to listen to old man Wharton, talking about the Sunday New York Times or what was in the Wall Street Journal on Friday. You know what I mean? And so that's a barrier that I have to deal with so often. But I'm trying to get them to get in the habit of that. And that's what I mean by political socialization. Get them into that, skill set of recognizing you have to do this habitually and being aware. Sorry, yep.
Can you talk a little bit about the state constitutional issues, possible amendment of state constitutions as a buttress against some of the decisions coming out from the Supreme Court, and what what Congress is doing?
Yeah, it'd be interesting because obviously the states have a lot of reserve powers. And, it'll be a matter of how maybe, not even so much the Supreme Court, but I'm also thinking the appellate courts, how they're going to rule so that it at least allows open, the floodgates for the Supreme Court to decide something like that, about what's considered constitutional even at the state level versus the federal government. It's, Right, and that's a good one, right? That's a good one to pick apart at least, right? And we're even seeing a bit of this as it relates right now to what's going on with transgender. I mean, obviously with issues surrounding that in terms of what the states can and can't do. I think a part of the problem that's not being discussed out there, though, is what the Court of Appeals will do in terms of making prior decisions and allowing for the door to be open for the Supreme Court to decide and make a decision so that they would get out of precedent or be in line. And the rule of the Supreme Court is that rule of 4. So as long as you get the support of 4 Supreme Court justices, it could be a likelihood. But before you do that, you have to do it with the gatekeepers at the appellate level. And that's why I'm kind of emphasizing. Right. If it gets that far, if it does. So it's a matter of testing the court case, testing the courts and seeing what could take place first. And if they make it that far, great. But we also know that sometimes Supreme Court justices don't want to go that far either, even beyond the appellates or even what the states have done. But I think there are going to be some challenges. I do, especially from the state side related to that. I think there will be. We're not out of the woods on this yet. And as much as we're thinking it'll be next year, we got a whole term to deal with this, and potentially even longer than that. So a lot of this is going to be new court cases. I'm willing to bet that, even as it's challenging the state constitutions. I'm just wondering which issue it'll be.
I feel like I have to defend young people a little bit. It's, access to voting is really difficult in the country. Even adults who have more flexible jobs don't vote, right? So
yes.
I'm curious on the state side and the local election level, what are some ways that they're decreasing those barriers to just voting, period?
Yes.
I feel like, when our young people are going to hundreds of thousands of debt to go to college and improve their lives, most of college students are food insecure and, are just unhoused, homeless. They're taking care of their elders and their siblings who have disabilities and still suffering from COVID, especially people of color and minorities. Sorry, I'm a sociologist, so I'm gonna attack that point. But
occupational hazard, I respect it.
yeah, I mean, it's not fair to just say that young people don't vote. Like, they probably want to vote. They're just a little busy trying to, they're in the struggle bus. So I was curious on the Connecticut side, on the election, are there efforts being made to address this barrier to voting, on local elections too?
It just happened recently because obviously now we have early voting. And so that's a good example of this, right? Because at least with early voting, we did see more engagement. We did see more involvement. And so that's a good start, where you're doing it days in advance and you don't have that you don't have that at least restriction of just one day. One thing that's been discussed in the past, and I don't know if it'll come up at the Capitol, but God knows they do this in New Jersey, making it a holiday. All right, especially for public employees. Because God knows in New Jersey, they did this in Hudson County. Of course, Hudson County, familiar with Hudson County, you know the place like Hoboken, Jersey City, is obviously a machine-run county. Of course, as a county employee, they took the day off, and I was a county employee, and I showed up. And if you didn't, trust me, the bosses knew. They kept tally. They're very old school in Hudson County, all right, especially in a place like Union City and Jersey City, because it might affect the outcome of your job as a county employee. So that's a good start, considering a holiday in addition to early voting. And I think one thing to get in terms of considering young people is, I'm going to go back to this over and over again, is for young people at least be aware and be alert to a lot of these things and why it's so critical, why it's so important at the local level, and reinforce this obviously in the classroom. And saying that as part of the curricula standards, even for something like, I don't know, let's say something like 9th to 12th grade, this is going to be part of the curricula, and why, even for local government, we should participate. Danielle, I was kind of intrigued, I'm sure you all were, what happened last year in Hartford. There were 12, 14 candidates for mayor? I couldn't keep track. I called up a couple of my friends from Hartford, like, you running for mayor too? Like, who is? It's like everybody, their mother's running for mayor, right? I could not keep track. And yet, we had all the candidates there. You had all this potential, different cross sections for just the Democratic ticket, and yet only 14% showed up. It was shocking. So even when you have all these candidates and you think, oh, more young people will do it more, that's tough. So I think getting more candidates coming from the political parties would be very helpful so that, you can say, look, we have all these candidates, here's your consideration, as opposed to the usual 1 or 2 candidates tops. So I'm going to go back to my old playbook of what political scientists will say is having a viable or more competitive local race can get more people to show up, and to emphasize that. Because that can at least do it, but it is difficult for those under 30. I will not, unless it's some one burning issue. But then I have my moments like what took place in Fairfield. I don't know if you all followed that race. That was so interesting, because it was a nail-biter for the selectmen's race last year, and yet what ended up happening was that all these kids from Fairfield University showed up because they were concerned about that one big issue, housing, where they lived around the beach, and how there was issues surrounding that, and the neighbors were very upset with them left and right. If you know about Fairfield Beach, God knows I'm always dog sitting down there, and it's like just typical provincial politics. They don't like this neighbor, they don't like the neighbor, I don't like young people, there are too many people in this house. It's the usual NIMBYism. And so a lot of young people from Fairfield University showed up, and all the pollsters, even locally, were shocked. Like, what is going on with all these college students showing up? You get one big issue doing it, they will be there. And I always pick on the city I lived in for years, was in Hoboken, and the candidate who won was an upset, won by 153 votes. Why? My school that I taught at, Stevens Institute of Technology, had over 600 students showing up. What were they concerned about? Little issues around the block, around the fraternity houses and sorority houses, and how the mayor was trying to challenge them on housing issues. It was quite interesting. And as a matter of fact, we purposely had a poll located in the engineering building so the students would show up. And they did. So I would say get one big burning issue, get a polling location going, get them engaged following the issues. It kind of make it as local and as provincial as possible for them to recognize why these issues are so important. So I think you do see moments where they can turn up. They can. I'm always hopeful that they can, but one big issue can do it. Hope that helps. Yes, sir.
Jonathan, can you talk a little bit about the national popular vote interstate compact situation? Does the Electoral College, does it have a future?
Do you know I get this every year when I teach U.S. government? Every year I get this about the Electoral College and what can be done about it. You all do know that there's always been a bill introduced to Congress every year. There's some lawmaker in Congress who's always pushing this. It doesn't go anywhere. It just doesn't. Congress is talking about it, they debate it, they get the resolutions out. You know what is part of it is? The party leaders, the party officials. They don't want to see it done away with. For them, it's a unique instrument that could be beneficial for both parties. So I don't see that going anywhere, Mike. I got to be fair with you, I don't. I would love for it to be changed and amended. I mean, we can go back to what took place, obviously. What was it, 1920, if I remember correctly, when they did end it for the Senate, because the Senate used to be through the Electoral College. That was a good start, but I just don't genuinely see it going anywhere, even though it's been introduced in Congress every dang on year. And I'm putting it on the parties. They both hate each other, but they love that issue and they say no. I mean, unless I'm back to my origins of grassroots politics where voters are up in arms and they're concerned, they're going to make it a big issue, and the lawmakers are going to follow, sure. But even among Americans, it's not the most critical issue. You had your question. Oh, yeah.
My question is about the new Department of Governmental Efficiency.
It's definitely not a department, it's an advisory panel.
Well, whatever it is, the pretend Department of
Right,
Governmental
right.
Efficiency. How do you think, they're saying that they're going to get $2 trillion out of the government. Obviously, that's going to impact things that go to the states.
Yes.
And how do you think that's going to affect things like the financial guardrails in Connecticut and other state programs that we have here in Connecticut that might get somewhat defunded?
It's a good point. A big aspect of this goes back to pork barrel spending coming from Congress with these special projects. So will it be one of these things where that particular agency or in the White House will clamp down on pork barrel projects, saying, well, we're not going to allow for this, saying that we're going to limit the funding for special projects like transportation, bridges, that kind of thing. I think a lot of lawmakers are going to be upset with that. I don't think they're going to be on board with it because for them, that's important back to the district. It gets them reelected. So anytime they try to do that, there's a great deal of resistance, and I don't see Congress getting 100% behind that with pork barrel projects. Are there going to be cutbacks related to entitlements? Yes. I think there's going to be some proposals going to be suggested to deal with expenditures and issues surrounding Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. You're already hearing this already. But again, there's going to be probably a good resistance because one thing people in Washington already know, retired people are going to be up in arms about that. I'm always emphasizing in class, AARP's got one of the largest buildings in Washington, D.C., and they have their own zip code. And you want to talk about going up against people who got time on their hands and money and resources, don't go against retired folk. So there could be a natural resistance to this because older people vote. And so there could be a response against the entitlement reforms too. But I'll tell you the biggest sacred cow to follow, military expenditures. If they cut back on that within the budget, that would be fascinating because remember, we spent a lot of money on military, a lot of money. So could there be a possible cutback on that? More than likely. Because remember what Trump has been arguing over and over again, he doesn't want to see the U.S. involved in wars. And so instead, it's going to be more about, less of that than anything else. So I think between the big three sacred cows, I'd probably say that might be a good bet. Good question, though. Oh, yes, sir. Go ahead, good doctor.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much, Jonathan. Appreciate it. I know we're wrapping up the Q&A portion. One of the questions I had was about echo chambers. And I want to know your thoughts a little bit. A lot of my friends and I, we talk about where we get our news and where we don't get our news and where we don't go. And it's very easy to say, especially after the election, we need to break down the echo chambers and get the word out, whether it's on one side or the other, to make sure that our message is being heard by people. But a lot of times I talk to folks and they say, well, I don't want to leave my echo chamber. I want to get my news from where I get my news. Yep. And I know that was a big debate when Kamala was thinking about going on the Joe Rogan podcast, and that was an example of breaking down echo chamber and, trying to reach people where they are. So, talking about people and where they get their news, whether it's, Fox News, Newsmax, MSNBC, CNN, or, non-traditional media, whatever, what are actual solutions to breaking down those echo chambers beyond just saying things like we need to meet people where they are? That sounds more and more like it sounds more like a cliche now than anything. I don't really know what it means to, we got to meet people where they are outside of their echo chambers. Like, how do we actually get in front of the right people?
Yeah, this is an issue I'm constantly battling, and not even so much in my classroom, but even with colleagues at Southern. And not just even so much in my political science department, we have a journalism department. And we're constantly talking about this because a couple of them have written, actually they were editors for the Connecticut Post and a couple of the Valley newspapers. And one actually for the Hartford Courant, has been a columnist for years. And so we're constantly talking about this with print media. But the problem is that so many students and younger people don't read print media, even online. And so one of the things you have to consider is it one of these things where you have to kind of educate or retrain people to consider, as you said, all these different sources? Because obviously print media is kind of going by the wayside for younger people. I don't want to ignore, by the way, cable news, because that's definitely going by the wayside for younger people and just Americans in general. A lot of people are fed up with cable news. But you know what's interesting? We still tend to listen to a lot of evening news. It's interesting. I've been kind of obsessed with this, and I want to find data for this. Apparently, even among young people, there's still an interest every once in a while to listen to the podcasts of the evening news from NBC, CBS, even if it's going to be replayed again on podcasts, or even NPR, or something like this. And so that's interesting that that still lingers, because at least with podcasts and the replaying of it online, that's still out there lingering when it comes to broadcast news that way. So that could be a good starting point. I would also emphasize this, which I'm kind of hopeful of, is also newswire services. That gets overlooked. Your AP News, Reuters, Millhouse, among others. There are others that actually can be very helpful, just make it very neutral. I mean, God knows I'm always praying for AM News to make a comeback. God knows I still miss 880, but that's just me. I know nobody listens to 880. I know I'm an old man here. And 1010's not doing it for me. But I would say go that way. Pay attention. I think the podcast is a unique thing because if the local news stations are doing it and the national news stations are doing it, why can't that be done as well, where the shows are recast and you can play it at any time and you can pay attention to it? That's a very good start. But we had to get back into that relearning and educating for so many people to recognize why that's so critical. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't recognize the difference between an editorial and hard-hitting news analysis, where the Wall Street Journal's done a huge piece that's going on for pages and pages. Why? Because it's going on for pages and pages. It's like a 3,000 word count, and nobody's got time for that. They'd rather have a 20-second soundbite on TikTok to know what's going on for the news, as opposed to reading pages and pages of what something like the Wall Street Journal's done, or my favorite 60 Minutes. Who's going to sit down in front of something like that for 10 minutes on a segment that could be really critical? And God knows nobody's really paying attention to the NewsHour. I love my PBS NewsHour, but that's just me. And again, we're not getting that either. It'd be great to get some kind of way to get that going, and I think podcasts are really good ways of starting that. But great question. Media literacy is my boof. It always gets at me. Last one? Last question? Great.
Is there any, I'm a elementary teacher.
Oh, God bless you. What grade?
5th grade.
Oh.
One of my students is part of the new kid governor.
Oh, hey, all right. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Good.
And so just being in the K through 12 world, my background is also in education policy. Is there any pressure coming from the institutes of higher ed in Connecticut on the K through 12 level to say, hey, we need more civics, focus on civics in that K through 12 system? Because like you said, yeah, by the time they come to Southern, they might not even be taking your class, right? I'm sure it's not compulsory to take your class, right?
Because some students AP out, so they don't need to.
Right, they're just like, we're done. Yep. And so I find it very concerning that we've really pushed social studies, history, and civics to the wayside throughout the past couple of decades, and even science. And now we had to make sure that we integrated science more into our school systems with the push for STEM and careers. Is there any pressure coming down, like, when kids are graduating high school and they're saying, hey, they're not placing into the math class, they're not placing into college level English? Is there any pressure coming down from the colleges to say, hey, kids are coming in and they don't know basic history?
Or even the fact that we have 2 chambers, that even exists in the General Assembly, let alone in Congress. I'm still battling.
My kids know.
Thank God. Because God knows my freshmen, they still think that the Supreme Court is a chamber. And I'm like, oh, God, guys, we went over this Virginia plan, New Jersey plan. Come on. And who was the one that negotiated? New York? No, Connecticut. Hello. I will say this. It's interesting. New York does the Regent exam, as you know. They require it, right? And it's funny. I had this whole dinner conversation with a bunch of New Yorkers on Tuesday about that. And Connecticut, obviously, is not as emphasized. And you know what struck me the most was, when I was living in New Jersey, I found out in some school districts directly, because I was involved with this voting project in Newark, and I was disturbed to find out because they were taken over by the state. The state did not require any discussion around civics or government at all. That really hurt my feelings, right? So here I am coming in as a graduate student, because I was on an Annenberg grant to measure and follow who these students would potentially vote for mayor. We had the mayoral candidates there. This was back when Cory Booker was my councilman. I don't know if you guys know who he is. He's the U.S. Senator. He's my councilman, the mayor right? And that was my dissertation topic, was voting engaging in a place like Newark. And so what I had to find out firsthand was they don't teach it for districts that are taken over by the state. Well, do you know how many cities in New Jersey are taken over by the state? Atlantic City, Newark, Jersey City was for years. It's the big cities. So it's interesting that at the local level you might not think this. The states don't even think in a place like New Jersey whether it's necessary. I started doing additional research. I found out the institute where I got the funding from, they conducted a study maybe 10 years prior. And do you know only 1 out of 4 school districts have anything related to civics or even the Constitution in their course requirement? That was amazing to me, even in the suburbs. So unless there's like a real challenge coming from school boards and teachers and PTAs saying, we need this already to begin with, and by the way, I'm not even saying so much high school, I'm with you. Start this off in middle school, do it in elementary school. But I think unless it's coming from the parents, it's coming from the teachers, you know, for us at least, when it comes to with higher ed, it's a difficult one because I got to say, you're assuming that we even have classes like state and local government at universities. We generally don't. I'm kind of an anomaly because, first off, state and local government is not really taught at a lot of universities. It's always about national government. It's always about statistics. It's always about constitutional law. I'm kind of a freak because few states have state and local government curricula even at public universities. California, they got like 10 of me at each university, all right? And I'm kind of the weirdo, the one person at my school doing it. So if I'm having that already at the public university, imagine what's going on even within higher ed around Connecticut where it's barely being taught and enforced. So I think it'd be great if that could be kind of emphasized in doing kind of what other states are trying to do to tackle this issue. But I think New York is an interesting one with the Regents exam as an example of what's preparing them before they get to college. Yeah, but good question. Bingo. I was about to say, I know somebody's going to make a great pitch for that. So who's going to close us up and discuss? You are, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. Thank you all. Appreciate it. She set you right up.
She sure did. Anita and I have known each other forever, so it's kind of like we just lob balls at each other, and it's like, okay, somebody will pick it up. One of us will. But I really do want to thank Jonathan. It was such an extensive. And I want to thank everybody here who had such great questions, because one of the things that we want to do as the Connecticut Democracy Center is we want to cross that bridge. We want to, you know, we always hear, or I've always heard, that teachers are overwhelmed and they're not looking to add any more to the curriculum, any more to what they have to put in their day. So I don't know how much freedom teachers have to say, and maybe you can tell me, you know, we want to teach physics or geography even. I was talking to a couple of young kids and they didn't even know where the Middle East was, you know, and so they take certain things out of schools, but how much freedom do you have as a teacher to decide what kind of curriculum you want to teach? Yes. Yeah, please. None of us are in your spot, so.
I think if it's important to the teacher, I'll be really honest, I think if it's important to the teacher, they're going to teach it, right? I don't sacrifice, so I taught 3rd grade last year, so I taught all content. You'd get social studies maybe twice a day or twice a week for about 20 minutes, okay? And then science was social studies was once a week for 20 minutes. Science was twice for 20 minutes. That has now changed. I now am the primary 5th grade science teacher, and it is now considered a core subject. So, but then you have humanities, which is now English, writing, and social studies combined for about 30 minutes a day. Social studies, history, civics is extraordinarily important to me. And I never sacrifice that time for another subject, whether it was math or reading, whether SBAC testing was, coming at me and I knew my kids needed to pass. So I will say that if it's important to the teacher, they will teach the content. I will say that curriculum for social studies is not unified across the state. I think we need to start there. We need solid curriculum. When I went to school, I had a social studies book. Okay, I had a hardcover social studies book, and it had, it was your curriculum, Pearson, Mifflin, whatever it was. We don't have that anymore. I bought an old textbook for 3rd grade, made copies of it, and gave it out to my kids so that they could learn proper social studies curriculum. I'm a cusp generation. I'm Gen Z millennial. So, or not Gen Z, millennial Gen X. So I have that Gen Xer, but also the millennial in me, and I see both sides of, you know, what we do as far as how we've taught our children. And so I think we need to start with strong curriculum and have some kind of formatting across the state of Connecticut. It can't be every district for themselves, because we're going to see that inequity and disparity amongst our very affluent districts, and, you know, the have and have-nots. I've taught in Willimantic, I teach in Hamden, and I grew up in Clinton. So I've seen this, and I earned my teaching credential in Los Angeles and my master's in Seattle. So I've seen a lot of how education works. But I say we have to start with solid curriculum that all districts can access and teach, and that will take a lot of pressure off of the teachers and the districts to come up with curriculum.
You have to be sitting at the right table, because your two table mates actually do work with a group of professionals who want to actually come up with civics, and they certainly have done civics curriculum for different school districts. But to your point, it's for different school districts and not everybody across the board. So we've already got a head start on that. So hopefully we can work that together. Thank you guys so much. Thank everybody so much. I want to thank the caterers. Awesome display, awesome food choices. Thank you very much for that. Paul, his team with audiovisual, thank you very much for all of that. My fellow board members, and of course the staff to the Connecticut Democracy Center, thank you all for coming. And just want to let you know, we're going to be doing more civics on the road, but we have a website. Please ask any kind of questions you want. If there's something that you didn't get a chance to ask tonight, go to our website. Ask a question. You know, we'll get back to you. Somebody will answer you. But we need everybody. If you think civics is important, then we hope you will support the Connecticut Democracy Center, because we think it's critical. As Jonathan had pointed out, 14, 10, 15% of people voting is not good for an entire country. You know, that means only a minority is setting the pace and deciding what should happen for everybody. So please, thank you. And if you have any questions, let us know. Good night, everybody. Be safe. Get home safe.